All right, we're going to get started talking about story structure, primarily paraphrases and quotes, which help us move through a story. And we're familiar with quotes, particularly famous quotes that are inspirational, but we're also familiar with quotes because of memes. You see a lot of quotes in memes, and some of them are quotes that are in the memes, and some of them are just, very creative things that we've made up. But quotes are somebody's actual words, and they play a very important part in storytelling and in our media writing structure. So if we're looking back at the inverted pyramid again, you can recall we talked about the lead being the most important part, sort of the who, what, when, where, why, some of those W's in the lead. And then we often go to some more facts and a paraphrase and a quote, or sometimes we put our very best quote right after the lead. If it's something that you can write the lead and then this quote sort of supports the lead and makes perfect sense, then that can be also a good way to organize the story. So let's take a look at what we're talking about here. So quotes are somebody's exact words, and we can tell that because there are quote marks around it. So a concept that you're probably familiar with. This is one from the Red Solo Cup, like when it was having the 75th birthday of the Red Solo Cup. So here's the quote. "People make flowers out of these cups," Solo Vice President Kim Healy says. "We had someone make a full lobster costume out of these cups, head to toe." So that's kind of it's a nice quote. It adds some color and flavor to the story. And we attribute it to the person who said it, which is the president of Red Solo Cup, President Kim Healy. In this case, the paraphrase, they use a paraphrase after. I prefer the paraphrase before, but it just depends on how you're structuring the story. So a paraphrase it's information you got from the source, so we need to attribute just about everything we write. So unless we know it's pure fact, the sky is blue, the earth is round, that sort of thing, we attribute information. So a paraphrase is somebody's information that you got from an interview or from a source, but you're putting it together in a way that makes sense because we don't always talk in very succinct, I want to write it in this order sort of statements. So here's the paraphrase. "Yet the very first Solo cups weren't red. The company was one of the first to market those little paper cone cups you'd see at water coolers back in the 1940s. Until disposable cups came along, it was hard to take a quick drink," Healy says. And so even this part here, she may have said something very close to this, which would have been a quote, but you have to decide what you save for the quote because that is the flavor and adds impact to the story, and what you sort of condense into the paraphrase because she may have taken 15 minutes to say this and sprinkled it throughout. But as a paraphrase, you are ethically permitted to put it together so long as it's in context and the information came from her. So it's when we're talking about online and print writing, the quote style is the same, right? So it's the exact words spoken by the source you interviewed. You're going to give full attribution or identification to the person who said it. We use said as the verb. There are many other words that you will see, and you may be accustomed to writing where you had to use a different attribution each word, added, exclaimed, all those things. Said is a very neutral verb. It doesn't get in the way. So we are just going to use said. And generally we do noun verb, so Healy said. That's the way we would structure a sentence. We like that noun verb structure. It is possible to do it the other way. Said Healy, especially if you have a long title afterwards, then we might say said Healy, who was on the development team for the Red Solo Cup. Quotes are usually one or two sentences, so one sentence is fine. Two sentences, this is a really sort of traditional way to do the quote, right? So we've got this sentence, the attribution between the sentences, and then the next sentence. We don't like to split a sentence with the attribution. Now you can, and you will see it done that way, and I think the textbook even points it out that you can do it that way. So you could put attribution in here with a comma, and then another comma after the attribution. That's just kind of clunky, so we're going to stick with these couple of simple formats. I like paragraphs to be in quotes to be in their own paragraph. That is not a hard, fast rule, but you will see it that way a lot, and it gives the quote its own space, right? It lets the quote sort of speak for itself and be this gold nugget for the reader to encounter. So I like, especially in this class when we're sort of doing the basic rules, I like quotes to be in their own paragraph. Definitely pay attention to the proper punctuation. Quote marks, the comma before the attribution, right? Not a period here, even though that's a sentence, but we're going to finish the sentence with the attribution, and then quote marks, and then this period. Messing up on quote punctuation can really bring your grade down, so do pay close attention to that. So the paraphrase, or sometimes we call it an indirect quote, right? Just what we said before. So the information came from the source, but it's not their word for word. And one really important thing is the paraphrase and quote should not duplicate each other, right? So you want each one of those things to stand on their own, to be new information. We only have so much space and time, right? So people aren't going to keep going if you're telling them the same thing twice. So the paraphrase should state information, and then the quote should have new information. They should not repeat each other. Paraphrases don't have to be the exact words. In fact, they're not usually the exact words that the person spoke, but sometimes they are. Right? The difference would be is we would take out if somebody said, I did this or something, a paraphrase would never have that. That's just in a quote. Everything needs to be kept in context, right? So that's the ethics part of it, is you don't pick and choose things to make it sound like somebody supported something or was making a point that they weren't making. And we do include attribution in the paraphrase. So Healy said, and because there are no quote marks, that's our sort of code or form in English to tell people that these aren't her exact words, but this information came from her. So please trust me that this information came from her. When we think about quotes and all the information in your story, I mean, just think about how confusing it is if you just toss all the information into the road and say, here, reader, find your way through this path, put it in some sort of order. We like paraphrases and quotes to really sort of help guide us through the story. So if you think of putting together your story, it needs to make sense, right, for the reader to read through it. So let's take a look at an artful way to do this. Here's a story about the YMCA downsizing to a single letter being called the Y. And so in this story, if you were to go to read the whole story, there are 6 sources in these 18 paragraphs, 760 words. So 6 sources, that's a nice number of sources. It really helps people believe your story, right? And you get all the credible information in there. So let's look at how this paraphrase leads into this quote. Soon a special dictionary will be necessary to help navigate all the abbreviations being adopted as formal names by companies and charities like KFC, BP, XE, AARP. A few months ago, National Public Radio sent a note to all its staff members asking everyone to refer to it as NPR. So then here's the quote. In many ways, we are just catching up to our audience, said Dana David Ream, NPR's Senior Vice President for Marketing and Communication. So here we go from talking about NPR. We expect this to expand upon that. Now, if this came and spoke about something else, it'd be like, where did that come from? So it makes sense that this then extends more information about NPR from this previous paragraph. Here's another sort of traditional paraphrase. So John Dyson, chief executive of Red Scout, a brand strategy company in New York, said adopting abbreviations in lieu of long names could make sense in the era of Twitter with its 140-character diktat and apps for mobile phones. So here's the quote. There's a real need to make everything fit into a bite-sized piece, Mr. Dyson said. The Y has an app, but nonprofits have not fully embraced that, in part over their vexation with Apple, which prohibits the use of the iPhone apps for fundraising. So this is the person who is giving you some information in the story, so it makes sense that the quote we read will be from that same person, right? It's a little bit like, okay, now you're going to hear a voice. It's going to be the person we just introduced you to. A couple of notes on this. Twitter doesn't have a 140-character restriction anymore, but this is from the New York Times. They use the courtesy title, Mr. on second reference. AP does not. We are not going to use courtesy titles on second reference. And AP also occasionally, New York Times occasionally does this parenthetical phrasing. We don't see that very often. We're not going to use that so much in our writing. Again, all rules that can be broken once you know what all the rules are. But for this class, we're going to stick with the rules. Quotes should have impact, right? Like, don't quote something that says the event will start at 10 o'clock. That's something you can handle in, just the basic words, right? So the quote should be something that you're like, yes, that's a good quote. So while the public seems to have no trouble embracing abbreviated names, the news media often remains stubbornly attached to old names. AARP dropped its full name in 1999 and is frustrated that reporters still identify it as formerly known as the American Association of Retired Persons. Some names die hard, said Michelle Alvarez, a spokeswoman for AARP, which changed its name in acknowledgement that more than half of the nearly 40 million members are not retired. So it's a short quote, right? But it sort of gives you that like, boom, here you go. Here's the short little quote. And what's interesting about this, right, is that when you think about things dying hard, right, is that this is giving sense to somebody talking about strategy, somebody saying, here's this frustration, and now here's a little bit of sense of that frustration. So I asked you before this lecture to watch the story by Boyd Huppert on Lexi. So I hope you did that. And if you didn't, you should pause this video now and go watch that because A, it is excellent. Boyd Huppert is an amazing storyteller. So try to recall some of the quotes, or in this case, because it was broadcast, but they're actually called sound bites in the parlance of media. So sound bites, but if we were typing them on a screen, they'd be called they'd be called quotes. And because Boyd actually does both, he produces the broadcast story, writes that, then he has to turn around and write it for the web. He does use the quotes on the web story, which were sound bites in the broadcast story. Gosh, that could be confusing. So here's a few that I really liked. I like walking. Right? That's a really simple statement from Lexi, but you hear her voice, it's just precious. I can go backwards. Look, I'm going backwards. And then when the doctor said she would never walk, like we set that up with, right? The doctor said she wouldn't walk. Then, yeah, I showed him about her hands. They don't work like yours because I was born like that. So really these precious little moments. And Boyd had to pick which ones to use because Lexi is a remarkably quotable child. Then her mom saying, I could never do what she does. And then her mom, a longer soundbite, I wouldn't change her for anything. She's brought so much to my life about learning how to love people for who they are and just acceptance. So really nice moments in the story, right? So as we're writing, and this is true of broadcast and of our writing for online or print, is that there's an art to not walking on a good quote, right? There's an art to leading the reader right up to the quote and then allowing the quote to be this great golden nugget or this great piece of information that they're going to read. And so we can do it poorly. It can be done poorly in broadcast, can be done poorly in online or print writing. So I hope you're going to do it the way that works well. So let's read these. Jamie Dietz said her daughter has taught her to be accepting and she wouldn't change her. I wouldn't change her for anything. She has brought so much to my life. So does that work for you? Does that work for you? I don't think so, right? What I don't like about this is it says her daughter's taught her to be accepting. It wouldn't change her. That's pretty much what this says, right? So sometimes we were taught to write this way back when. This is bad practice, right? Let this leading up to the quote be new information. So let's look at this. More than anything, Dietz wants Lexi to be independent. As Lexi picks up her sandwich between her first and second toes, it's clear she's done more than meet her mother halfway. Then the quote about how she wouldn't change her, right? So this is much better practice. And sometimes because we're doing it when Boyd writes it for the web, he has to describe a little bit of what he saw in the video, right? So somebody may not watch the story. They may not watch the broadcast. They may just read the story. Also, if we need a couple little technical things, if you need to leave something out of a quote, you've got to tell the reader it's not there. I took this chunk out of the middle. You use ellipses. In general, avoid that. It always makes the reader think, what'd you leave out? So artfully, just pick a sentence that you can use completely, right? Also, we use parenthetical references sometimes. That means we've got the paraphrases. AP says this, not the brackets. So if you need to insert something to bring clarity to the quote, that's okay. We see that more often. Still better if you don't have to do that. I think oftentimes we put them in there because we think we need it, but if you reflect on it, you read it, it made sense without it. So anyway, that's how we handle those two things. And one last word, said. Just said, not claimed, not added, not exclaimed, not giggled, not opined, said. It just doesn't get in the way. It's a good word. All right, that's it for now.